Education Unit is releasing its analysis of the Governor's 2012-13 Proposition 98 budget package. In our analysis, we provide a detailed assessment of the Governor's basic budget plan, which assumes that voters approve his November 2012 ballot measure that would raise certain taxes temporarily. Our analysis also provides detailed assessments of all of his major policy proposals, his multi-year plan to retire certain existing education obligations, and his backup budget plan were his tax measure to fail. So in the next few minutes, I wanted to highlight some of the major recommendations we make in the report. Starting with the Governor's basic budget plan, the largest component, the Governor proposes to increase total Proposition 98 funding by $4.9 billion between the current year and the budget year. The largest spending component of this plan is to provide $2.4 billion to pay down existing K-14 payment deferrals. If the state has additional resources to spend in 2012-13, we think using them to pay down existing deferrals is reasonable. If the state were to take this approach, it would help relieve school districts and community colleges who are facing cash management problems because of all of the late payments that they're receiving from the state. But we also think that in the event that the ballot measure fails, rescinding these deferral paydowns would be less disruptive for schools and community colleges than imposing deeper mid-year programmatic cuts. Even if the legislature were to adopt the Governor's proposal to pay down these deferrals, the state would still be making $8.1 billion in Proposition 98 payments late. So I wanted to turn and touch quickly on three of the Governor's policy proposals, starting with the Governor's education mandate proposal. The Governor proposes to eliminate roughly half of the mandates that the state places on school districts and community colleges and fund the remaining mandated activities through a discretionary $200 million block grant. Over the last several years, our office has highlighted some of the serious flaws with the existing mandate system, including higher than anticipated costs, reimbursement rates that vary dramatically across districts, as well as a system that has virtually no incentives for districts to provide services, either efficiently or effectively. We think a block grant approach would greatly simplify the existing system, as well as address many of its shortcomings. So we recommend the legislature adopt a block grant approach and then create a working group to help work through implementation details over the next few months. The Governor also has two big proposals to change how the state allocates funding to school districts and community colleges. So starting with school districts, the Governor proposes to replace the state's existing funding model with a weighted student formula. He proposes phasing in the weighted student formula over the next 5 years. Given that the existing K-12 funding model is so complex and inequitable, we recommend that the legislature adopt some version of the Governor's proposal. Our primary concern with the Governor's proposal is that we don't think it provides enough incentive for districts to continue devoting additional resources to either English learners or low-income students. So we recommend the legislature add some general spending requirements to ensure that districts continue to dedicate resources to their disadvantaged students. For community colleges, the Governor proposes consolidating all categorical funding into one discretionary flex item. We believe that offering community colleges more flexibility, more discretion has benefit, but as with school districts, we're concerned that by removing all strings, some districts might not provide sufficient funding for support services. So we offer the legislature two alternatives to consider: a somewhat more limited version of the Governor's flex item approach or a block grant approach. And under the block grant approach, we think the legislature could consider having a block grant for student support as well as one for faculty support. We think under either of these alternatives, the legislature would have enhanced local flexibility while still ensuring that campuses have incentives to support faculty and students. In addition to these policy proposals, the Governor has a multi-year plan that would retire certain existing education obligations. We think having such a plan in place is prudent budgeting practice, but we have several refinements for the legislature to consider, including extending the payment period, spreading out payments more evenly throughout the period, designating certain funds known as settle-up funds to be used for mandate or deferral obligations, and then redirecting some anticipated program savings to other related obligations, In essence, we're trying to ensure that the state gets the maximum value out of every dollar to help reduce its existing obligations. The legislature will need to modify this plan if baseline revenues were to come in lower or the governor's tax measure to fail. But we still think having a plan in place is critical if the state's to make steady progress to retiring its existing obligations. Lastly, turning to the governor's backup plan if his tax measure were to fail. Under this scenario, the governor proposes $5.4 billion in reductions across sectors of the state budget. Of this amount, $4.8 billion would be Proposition 98 reductions. So these reductions would account for 90% of the governor's entire mid-year trigger plan. So we have two notable concerns with the governor's trigger plan. The first relates to his treatment of debt service payments. Under the governor's backup plan, he would begin counting K-14 debt service payments toward the Proposition 98 minimum guarantee. Because debt service payments are much more volatile than Proposition 98 funding, the effect would be that school and community college operations would be subject to much more volatility than they have in the past. Absent a compelling policy rationale, we don't see why the state would want to change its long-standing education facility funding practices, particularly when it results in such a significant reduction to school and community college operations. Our second concern has to do with the governor's treatment of certain revenues. Under his backup plan, he assumes that the 2011 realignment-related sales tax revenue can be excluded from the Proposition 98 calculations, and we think this treatment is risky. If it were decided that the state had to count these revenues toward the Proposition 98 minimum guarantee, the guarantee would go up by $1.7 billion, and the governor's backup plan would need to be modified, either by suspending the guarantee or by funding the higher guarantee and cutting $1.7 billion out of other areas of the state budget. As the legislature is considering how best to develop a backup plan, we think it's important not only to take into account these two concerns, but also to think about, anticipate what the impact on school districts and community colleges is likely to be. So because districts know that the tax measure might fail, and because it's difficult for them to make mid-year changes, we think that many districts will budget based upon the state's backup plan. This means that it's very important for the legislature to be very deliberate in how it builds such a plan. If the legislature were to build a plan that contained mid-year cuts, then it obviously will need to identify a target level of state savings, decide how to allocate those cuts among education and non-education programs, and then decide what specific K-14 cuts to impose. And the legislature could decide to allocate these cuts differently than the governor. For example, it could decide that it doesn't want to impose such significant reductions on schools. Alternatively, the legislature could take a different approach, and it could make cuts up front, and then it could decide that if a tax measure were to pass, how it wanted to spend the additional resources. And under this scenario, it could spend those resources for one-time investments in 2012-13, for example, paying down deferrals, and then build those revenues into the budget on an ongoing basis beginning in 2013-14. Finally, given all the uncertainty that districts are facing over the coming year, we recommend the legislature provide them certain tools to help them respond. In our report, we offer a package of flexibility options, including removing additional categorical and mandate programmatic requirements, shortening the school year, raising or suspending class size caps, modifying or suspending the requirement on the number of full-time faculty that community college districts employ, as well as offering a post-election special layoff window. Thank you for listening to our webcast. You can access our full report online. We hope you find it helpful.